Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Eco Summit 2020, brought to you by the St. Francis of Assisi Care for Creation Committee. Well, we are at about 5 after. What do you think, Scott? Should we go ahead and formally get things kicked off here?
I think so. We've got a pretty good crowd here tonight.
All right. Good deal. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Good. So just by way of formal introduction, I'd like to say good evening and thank you very much for joining us for this first ever Eco Summit brought to you by the Care for Creation Ministry from St. Francis of Assisi Catholic Church in Triangle, Virginia. Just momentarily here, just for a minute, I'm going to go ahead. I'll warn you, Scott and Aleta, I'm going to turn our camera feeds on so that the crowd can see us and they're not just looking at slides. So there you go. Hello, everybody. This summit was created as a way for us to celebrate both the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which happens this year, and the 5th anniversary of Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. I am Brandon Jubar, the Director of Youth Ministry at St. Francis, and I'll be your host for this evening's webinar. It's all about saving money, helping the environment, kind of a DIY composting and organic gardening. And the presentation is Compost, Nature's Way of Recycling. We all know, or hopefully we know, that composting helps the environment by keeping organic waste out of landfills. And we also know that organic fruits and vegetables are healthier and generally, to be honest, more expensive. So during the webinar, you'll learn about how to compost properly, some tips on how to grow your own food organically. It's definitely a win-win scenario, and I've been saying that for quite a while now. We all have time for we will have time for questions and answers after the presentation, but Aleta, who I will introduce momentarily, has asked that you please feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation. So we will try to make this a little bit more interactive. Scott, who I'll introduce in a moment here, will be monitoring the chat. And between the two of us, we will chime in as you have questions. So you can put your questions in the chat. There's also at the bottom of your screen below the webinar, there should be a place for you to actually put questions. Now, if people get talking and quote chatting in the chat, your questions could fly by rather quickly. We'll try to keep an eye on that, but your best bet might be to put your question into the question section in the bottom of your screen. So anyways, my co-host, introduce my co-host for this webinar is Scott Dean. Scott, go ahead and wave to everybody.
How you guys doing? Hello, everybody.
Scott is a life science teacher for Prince William County Schools, where he runs a green club for middle school students, bless his heart. He is a member of the Prince William County Schools sustainability team, and Scott has taught for 26 years in Virginia. Now, outside of school, he's a member of the Electric Vehicle Association of Greater Washington, D.C., and he co-chairs our St. Francis Care for Creation Committee. And that's the team, as I said, who brought this Eco Summit together. Scott will be helping me monitor the chat, as I said, and any questions that you submit, he will make sure that Aleta sees those questions. Speaking of Aleta, last but certainly not least, I am very pleased to introduce our presenter this evening, Aleta Daniels. She is the Executive Director of Keep Prince William Beautiful. KPWB is a community partner with the Prince William County government. So their programs are centered on encouraging and educating community members on how to be better environmental stewards, with an overall goal of making Prince William County a more clean, green, and beautiful place to live. So Aleta, good evening. Welcome to the St. Francis of Assisi Eco Summit 2020, and I will turn it over to you.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. And I am so pleased to be here tonight. I'm really sorry that it can't be in person. Obviously, we all know why that can't be, but I am still glad that there are so many people attending, even through a virtual presentation medium. So yes, I am the Executive Director of Keep Prince William Beautiful. We are an affiliate organization with Keep America Beautiful. So that is a national organization, and there are affiliates and sister organizations peppered all throughout the United States. So we all share a common goal of creating a clean, green, beautiful environment to live in for our kids to grow up in. Our biggest focus is litter and recycling efforts. So we do a lot of this through outreach and education. We also do litter pickups. We make recycling bins available for large public events. So we have a really wide variety of ways to connect with our community members. So my favorite part of my job is the outreach and education. So this is what I do best. I have a background, master's degree in environmental science, and I have been a teacher and an educator for many years. So I really enjoy this. And so I guess we will get started here. All right. So what I've found when I have been talking to people about compost is that a lot of people have a general idea what it is. They know that you are taking items like you see on the left, so food scraps, lawn clippings, etc., and you turn it into what you see on the right, beautiful, dark, healthy soil to grow your fruits and vegetables in. So that is what compost is in a nutshell, but there is a whole lot more going on than a lot of people really understand, because you're just looking at the superficial degradation of those materials, and then you just know it's something that you plant your seeds and your plants in. So compost is actually a lot more complex. I find it fascinating because I'm a scientist at heart, and when I first understood exactly what was going on a almost like a microscopic level, it is absolutely fascinating. So if you know the basics, you can have a very successful compost system at home, and then you can use that to grow your own foods, which is phenomenal that we can do that. This graphic is a basic representation of the average American family's trash pile. So this is on average what gets thrown into the trash on a monthly or a yearly basis. It comes from the DEQ. So you'll see that I have these blue arrows here that are highlighting a couple of those lines there. The top one is yard debris. That makes up just about 10 or 11% of the average American family's trash pile, meaning it goes into the landfill. The bottom arrow there is pointed at food waste, just about 6.5% of the trash pile that goes into the landfill. And then you'll notice, if you can see that blue square that's highlighting the word organics. So that's typically what our compost is made out of, which is organic material. So if you look at those, that's about 22, little over 20% of our trash is actually items that we can use in our own yard. We can take it out of the landfill, and we can use that to grow our own fruits and vegetables, and just generally reduce what we are sending to the landfill, which is always a good thing, as we are finding out that we are starting to run out of space with our landfills. So I'm happy to do my part there. What I've also found as I have talked to people about composting is that there's a lot more confusion than you might think over what the term organic means. So a lot of people have their own definition. Some people don't quite understand what that means. And it's confusing because it has so many different definitions. So the three main definitions, if you're a scientist, the first two definitions are what we as scientists normally think of when we think of the term organic. A discerning grocery store shopper might think of that third definition in terms of organic. So the first two definitions being a little more scientific. Organic means it's relating to or obtained from living things. This is what we call organic matter. When you're out walking in the woods and you see downed trees and you see flowers living and growing and then dying and returning to the soil, that's all organic matter. Maybe you pass a poor skunk or a raccoon on the side of the road. That is organic matter, and it all goes back into the soil to feed that next life cycle. That second definition, it's relating to carbon compounds. If I say an item is organic, at its essence, it means that it contains carbon. And if any of you had taken a biology course when you were in middle school, high school, or science, you may remember, it might be the only thing you remember, that carbon is the backbone of life. So everything living has carbon in it. So that third definition, which if you are a shopper who prefers organic fruits and vegetables, that's what you might think of when you hear the term organic. It just means that it's food that's grown or made without the use of artificial chemicals. When done properly, it is a way of not just taking from what the earth can give us in terms of our food, but also giving back, because you are taking nutrients out, but you are putting them right back in, because often organic farmers use compost in their farming methods.
Aleta, we have a question for you.
Excellent.
We have Paula Hillary wanting to know, what is DEQ?
Oh, I'm so sorry. That is a really great question. The DEQ is the Department of Environmental Quality. And I'm glad that you asked that, because I often forget to spell out acronyms when I'm doing a presentation. So they, Department of Environmental Quality, it's kind of, they oversee everything that has to do with our environment. All right, so I'm going to take this back to compost. So compost is an organic way of gardening. So organic, in meaning that you are taking what were once living materials that had that carbon source, meaning they were organic, and you are putting them back into the soil where they are going to break down or degrade or decompose back into their base being, the base composition of being nutrients. So compost has 5 major quote unquote ingredients. So every single one of these is going to be present in a healthy compost pile. And we'll go through all of those briefly here, but we have a carbon source, we have a nitrogen source, we have oxygen, heat, and water. So all of these to varying amounts are going to create a healthy compost. If they are not at healthy amounts, these different ingredients, you're going to have a compost pile that might be stinky or the food scraps don't break down, and you just don't end up with the soil that you think you're going to end up with. That first ingredient is our carbon source. We being gardeners or scientists, we like to call these our brown materials. So these are going to be twigs and sticks, dead leaves, sawdust, newspaper, cardboard, anything that is brown and wasn't very recently alive. This carbon source helps slow down the decomposition process. It slows down that creation of that soil. If you have too much carbon or too many of those brown materials in your compost pile, it is not going to break down, and you're just going to see those sticks and those twigs and those logs just hanging out for a very, very, very long time. In order to balance our carbon source, you have to have a nitrogen source. These are what we call our green materials, or ingredients that were very recently alive. So it could be your lawn clippings. That's going to be your kitchen scraps from last night's dinner that you take down to your compost pile. So these are very easy to break down. And so you have these to kind of balance that out. The different microbes that are doing the work for us that we'll talk about in a second, they love these nitrogen sources. So if you have too much, this is what gives you stinky compost. And this is also what attracts unwanted pests that are going to come in and try to get into your compost pile. The last three I'm going to kind of lump together here: oxygen, heat, and water. All of these are needed for a healthy compost pile. For the water, you want your compost to have a wet sponge or a damp rag consistency. So if it dries out, you just want to take a garden hose and just water the top of that compost. In order to get your oxygen into your compost pile, you can use a digging fork like that photo shows, and then just turn over your compost pile every couple of days, and that's going to let oxygen kind of work its way through your compost pile. And then heat, it naturally, your compost pile, you'll notice, is going to naturally get very hot. And that happens as those nitrogen sources and those carbon sources break down. And so it creates its own heat pile. And it can actually get incredibly hot. Like, you wouldn't want to stick your hand in the middle of your compost pile because it would burn your skin. So who's doing all of the dirty work here, all the heavy lifting, taking those kitchen scraps and those lawn clippings and turning them into that beautiful soil? Largely, it's the work of these three very important organisms. We have fungi, bacteria, and macroinvertebrates. And they all play their own distinct role in turning these ingredients into soil. All right. So fungi, and there's a couple of different, that picture up in the top left that you're seeing, that is the mycorrhizae. So those are the roots. When you're out in the woods, if you see a mushroom growing on a tree, or maybe you see one just popping up out of the soil, that is the fruiting body. But the cool thing about fungi is that they exist everywhere in the soil. Every step you take, you are stepping on miles worth of these mycorrhizae. And the cool thing about them, they've shown that as you're walking in the woods, the mycorrhizae, the fungi, they react to your footsteps. And they have shown, there's scientific evidence that as you're walking, they light up. They just almost like grow up to reach your footsteps. Which I think is absolutely fascinating. But the role that fungi play in breaking down these dead materials, they release enzymes that start the process of taking nutrients that were kind of bound up in what was once a living organism. They use enzymes to start pulling those nutrients apart and making them more accessible to the plants that are still growing in the soil. That picture on the bottom there, so some plants they have these little, you can see those little round nodules on those roots. So those nodules, they host a very specific type of fungi that's specific to that plant that breaks down enzymes and makes it available to those plant roots right there. That's what I studied for my master's degree. So I also find that incredibly fascinating. Bacteria, so these are the most numerous soil organism out there. Every teaspoon contains millions, if not billions, of bacteria in it. They also excrete their own enzymes that start to make nutrients break down. They start turning it into soil and making those nutrients available to plant roots, the ones that are still living and growing. Bacteria are the reason that we need oxygen in our compost piles. They need that oxygen to do their work and to excrete those enzymes. And there's a special bacteria called Actinomycetes. They kind of resemble fungi. Their role, they break down the very tough nutrients in there. The what's called cellulose, which is in the cell walls of plants. So it's a special type of bacteria. They start to eat the woody parts of sticks and twigs and leaves and sawdust, tough stems. They help break down newspaper. So these are kind of the heavy lifters in a compost pile. And you'll notice that these woody parts are often the last to give in and break down and turn into that soil, because they are so tough for the bacteria and the fungi to digest. And then the last of the organisms that are turning our food scraps into soil are the macroinvertebrates. So these are the earthworms, the beetles, the centipedes, the millipedes, those little roly-polies that you see every time you lift up a log in the middle of the woods. So these guys do an incredible amount of breaking down those larger food chunks and then making it available for the bacteria and the fungi to do their work. Earthworms, there's a special type of composting called vermicomposting that uses earthworms, and you can do this with just a little tote. And you can bring in some worms and just put a little Rubbermaid tote in there, and the worms will start to break down all the food scraps that you put in there. And this creates an incredibly rich, nutrient-rich source of compost to add to your garden. So earthworms are incredibly helpful. I want to take a second to talk about landfills, because if you remember that about 6.5% of the average American family's trash is full of food scraps. And a lot of people think that if they throw their food into the garbage, it goes into the landfill, it gets broken down anyway, right? Not exactly. So compost needs those important ingredients that I mentioned. It needs water and oxygen in order to break down into soil. And if you look at this picture of a landfill here, down at the bottom, you see the solid waste. That's where all of our garbage goes. You'll see a couple of layers on top of that. On top of all of those layers, we have a barrier layer and your topsoil. That barrier layer is there to keep water out, and it's to keep a lot of the pests out. And it does a darn good job at that. But the problem is oxygen and water can't get into the landfill. So there is a guy, he studies landfills, and he goes down into the bottom of these landfills, and he's basically an archaeologist, and he's using landfills. He's basically going through time, seeing how different societies lived, what they threw away, how much of it they threw away. And he has gone down and found 60-year-old banana peels and newspapers from the 1920s, 1940s. Things just don't degrade in a landfill because there's no oxygen and no water. So when you throw your food scraps out, into the garbage, thinking that it's still going to break down, still going to degrade, it does. It just takes hundreds of years rather than a couple of months. Okay. So it is incredibly easy to create your own compost pile if you know how to do it correctly. When I was growing up, my stepdad would not let us have a compost because he was afraid that there were going to be too many pests that were going to come in with the compost. And I tried to explain to him that you just had to make sure you had enough of those brown materials to kind of slow that down. And he never believed me. So I had to wait till I was in college before I started composting, but I am an avid composter now. So benefits to using compost, as Brandon mentioned at the beginning, it does save money. You're not out there bringing in tons of topsoil, tons of compost. You're making it there in your own backyard. The benefits also come from using compost instead of synthetic fertilizers. Compost has special macro and micronutrients that you just can't find in the synthetic fertilizers. Compost releases nutrients very slowly. Synthetic fertilizers are known for releasing all of their nutrients at once. And then when the next big rainstorm comes, all of those nutrients get washed away and they end up in our local streams and rivers and other water bodies. So compost is kind of a special slow release fertilizer. So you don't get that runoff and you don't get those nutrients piling up in our water bodies.
Aleta,
Yeah.
we have another question. Maybe just jump in here. Janet Broderick wanted to know, how do the fungi, bacteria, and macroinvertebrates get into the compost pile? Are they already in the food scraps? Are they just attracted to the mix that you put in there? What do you think about that?
So that's a really good question, and it kind of depends. So if you think of an animal, like an animal body, we kind of come preloaded with our own special bacteria that help break down the food that we ingest. So if an animal dies and it's out in the woods, there's already bacteria that are in there that are going to start that process. They start releasing those enzymes. And then it's just like, it's like that quote. I cannot remember the movie it's from, but they say, if you build it, they will come. It's a movie about baseball.
Field of Dreams?
Yes, that's right. Thank you. And that's exactly what's happening here. So as materials decompose, they give off, they're not quite pheromones, but you start to bring in all these critters that just come and they're just ready to do their work. And it is absolutely amazing. I wanted to say one more thing about that. There is a gentleman by the name of Paul Stammet, and he is a researcher who researches mushrooms specifically. And he did a research project where they were using mushrooms to clean up hazardous locations that had toxic chemical spills. And they found that the mushrooms, so when they planted this pile of the toxic chemicals with the mushroom spores, the mushrooms started popping up. And they started pulling those toxic chemicals out of the soil. And so they kind of became bound up in the mushrooms' fruiting bodies. Insects would come in. They were attracted to the mushrooms. So the insects would come in and start eating the mushrooms. Birds would come in and start eating those insects. Other animals started coming in. So these mushrooms, just by doing their job of cleaning up this toxic mess, this pile of things, they created their own ecosystem. And it's no different than if there's a tree that fell out in the woods and it starts to kind of decompose. Everything that's needed to do the job just shows up.
We have one more question here too, since we're talking about compost. Rich and Katie McClevey, they want to know, among the greens, can you add weeds, even if the weeds might have some seeds with them? And they want to know, will the seeds compost in a way that will not create a weed situation for your garden, say if you were to use that compost?
If you throw weeds in your compost, you are going to get weed seeds. So that's kind of up to you. You absolutely can throw them in your compost pile. They will break down. Seeds are amazingly resilient, and they will wait until the situation is ready for them to start growing. So yes, if you compost your weeds and you throw it on your vegetable garden, you are going to get many weeds coming up in that garden. I'm sorry to say. Any other quick questions about that? Those are really good questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a good question. That's all I see posted for now. So I'll tune back in if someone else posts one.
Okay. So back to the benefits of using compost at home. So I think I left off with using it as a soil amendment. So if you have sandy soils, like just this is what's in your backyard, you want to plant a garden, you start tilling up, you start removing that grass layer, and you find that you have very sandy soils, bring compost in. It's going to create a moisture-rich and nutrient-rich environment. Same thing for soils that are really clayey or really heavy with clay and hold a lot of water. Compost, if you bring that in, that's going to help move the water through the soil. So whatever your soil situation, bringing compost in is always a good idea. Because compost is full of tiny air channels and tiny little pores that hold that moisture and hold those nutrients. And it gives you a very strong soil structure. And then lastly, this kind of ties back to what I was saying about the mushroom story. So the nature of what compost is, with all of those nutrients that are in there, and it's free from chemicals, it is creating a safe environment for a diverse array of organisms to come in and just add variety and life to your garden. Now, for setting up your compost pile at home, these two that are pictured here, those tend to be the most popular DIY, do-it-yourself compost gardens that I come across. The one on the left is a 3-bin system. Typically, the way that works is you would have one bin for all of your, that's what you're dumping all of your scrap, food scraps in, lawn scraps, sawdust, whatever you're trying to add to keep down the stink or speed up the decomposition rate. And then as you kind of turn that first pile, as it starts to break down, you can move it into the second bin, let it rest a little bit more. And then by the time you move it to the third bin, you probably can't see in there because of the slats on the bins here, but that's basically, you let it become soil. And when you pull it out of there, it is ready to go onto your garden. So that's a pretty standard setup that I see. The one on the right, those are typically called tumbling composters. People like those for a number of reasons. One, they're generally enclosed, so there would be a lid that would go in the center there. So it keeps out the unwanted pests, keeps down any of the smell. And it certainly is kind of a foolproof way of having your own compost. The problem is that you kind of have to fill it up, and then you're still tumbling it, you're turning it. They often come with a little lever. You can open up the top, add a little water when you need to. So the downside with that is it often takes a little bit longer to get your compost because you have to keep filling it, keep adding it. So if you keep adding to it, you're never going to reach a point of having that just a beautiful handful of just pure soil. So you would have to maybe fill it all the way up and then turn it and wait a couple of weeks or a couple of months, pull all of your soil in, and then start over. I don't know if that makes sense, but so both of those kind of have their benefits and their drawbacks. But both of them will work just fine depending on what type of a garden situation you have.
So, Aleta, do you have a preference, or do you recommend one over the other?
What I've always done is I've had the one on the left, so that 3-bin system. I liked that one a lot. It worked for me. When I was I moved here from Knoxville, Tennessee about, back in October. So 7-8 months ago now, whatever month this is. They go on and on right now. And we had actually, my boyfriend and I had picked up some old pepper barrels. They were like 40-gallon, I think, and they were used for jalapeno peppers. We went and picked them up from a local company, cleaned them out really good, and we were going to turn that into a tumbling composter and then use the others for rain barrels. We never got to that point because we ended up moving here. But if you live in a townhouse situation, which is what I live in right now, you're going to want to do that tumbling composter. One, because last thing you want is your neighbors complaining if yours is a little stinking, if you haven't quite brought that balance in and brought in enough of those brown materials. So it really just depends on where you live. If I had an actual house and I lived in the country like I used to, my preferred method is the one on the left. I just find it to be a quicker process and results in a little bit a better soil because you have that 3-bin system.
Aleta, we have another question from Jim Bundy. He wants to know, are there ways to keep the vermin and other animals out of our compost pile when it's out in the open?
Yeah, definitely. So what I would say to that, especially if you have, maybe you can have like a 1-bin or a 2-bin system. So every time, or you might have a smaller compost that's a little bit easier to manage. Every time you put in your food scraps or your lawn clippings, put a layer of ash or sawdust, whatever you have, on top of those food scraps. That's going to, and then let that sit there for a little bit, and then you can start turning it. So that's going to basically cap the smell. Also, only put in vegetable scraps in your compost. Never compost meat products, never compost dairy products, and don't compost oil products. I only put in vegetable peelings, leftovers, from my cooking. That's all I put into my compost. So meat obviously will attract some vermin. Animal products have a lot of oil in them, and that just doesn't break down very quickly or very easily. And that is what's going to bring in the unwanted pests. But if you start out and you're really excited and you want to get going and you want to put this in your backyard, and you find that it is smellier than you would like, or maybe your neighbors come knocking on your door, find a little bit of that brown material and just add a lot more of that until you can kind of get that balance. With some practice, you will definitely find a rhythm and find what works for you. What I do recommend, I don't know, is everybody in here from Virginia, or is this from all over?
We have some from South Carolina and other places as well.
Okay. So every state has their own extension program. So Virginia has their Virginia extension. Those are often tied to their master gardener programs, agriculture programs, and they will have tips and tricks and sheets and lots of information saying which items, if you're having this problem with your compost, add X product to solve that problem, if that makes sense.
I had another share here from a Carol Evan.
Yeah.
Even, I don't know if you can see it in the chat, she has a bin from Gardner's Supply Company. It's about 4 feet by 3 feet. It does not tumble, but a little door slides up and down near the bottom to get the compost out. Works very well. I have to turn the compost with a garden fork, but she says, again, it works very well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way of doing that. So a lot of people get their start with backyard composting with a little bin like that, or if they're doing their vermicomposting where you bring in the earthworms and get that really rich compost. So a lot of them would start out with a little bin. What you find is that unless you have that little trap door that lets you get into where all the soil has formed, then you kind of have to disturb everything to get in there and pull the soil out. So wherever you got that from, that sounds just about perfect. It's small, it's easy to contain, it lets you get out what you want to get out without creating a mess. So yeah, there's lots of things that you can buy in any sort of a farm and garden supply store to get you started.
All right, that's all the questions and comments I see for now.
Okay, and I think, okay, so these are just a couple of tips. So they kind of go hand in hand with the benefits slide. That wasn't the one that we just had, but the one before that kind of goes hand in hand with that. But as you're starting your compost, the smaller you can make the materials, like your food scraps that you're adding, the better. If you're adding wood products like twigs and woody materials, make them as small as possible, because it just helps make it a little bit faster for those items to decompose. It makes it a little easier on your bacteria and your fungi, little buddies that are helping you out. Do check the moisture level every day or every other day. So maintaining that damp sponge level of moisture is really going to help keep it keep this a speedy process. And then turn your compost over every few days. Like Carol said, she has a little garden fork. Yep, that is my preferred tool to use for this. And then, like I mentioned in response to the question about keeping those pests out, every time you put that layer of green in, cover it with a layer of brown. My favorite products are ash and sawdust. I have a document that I can send to people with the best items to add to your compost? Is there a way that, like, if people want that, they can get that, or should I just say Google it?
So actually, Aleta, if you'd like to get that, to send that over to me, I will go ahead and post that on our website. And everybody who registered for the webinar, I will send them out the link to the document where they can download it. Okay.
So, and the reason I say that is because there's kind of like use these items, not these items. A lot of people use wood chips. Wood chips have those very hard to break down woody components that only those special bacteria that I mentioned, the Actinomycetes, can break down. So wood chips I use sparingly, but ash is probably the #1 layer of brown to add. So if you have a wood burning fireplace, or if you have a fire pit in your backyard, definitely take those, take the leftover ash and use that for your compost.
I think that we had a question about that while you're talking about it. Mike Hathaway wanted to know, what are your sources of ash?
Yeah, so like I just said, if you've got that wood burning stove or a wood fire pit in your backyard, that's what we always used. I grew up with my house was heated with a wood stove, and we would just take that out and then add that to our compost. Or if you have a neighbor, maybe that does.
We have a couple more questions popping in right now. We have Father Iggy wanted to know, can you get actual earthworms in Virginia, or is it a different type of worm?
Any sort of worm's going to work. It doesn't necessarily have to be an earthworm. The red wrigglers, I don't know what their actual name is. They're a little bit smaller. Those work great. That's actually what was in the picture that I had earlier, that had the pictures of your macroinvertebrates. So yeah, it definitely doesn't have to be earthworms. Any worm is going to do the job very well.
Iris Gill wanted to know, she doesn't have an actual vegetable garden. Can she just throw the scraps around her backyard?
The only reason that I would hesitate to say yes to that is if you're so yes, your food scraps are going to decompose. They are going to break down. When they're not in the actual compost bin and kind of have access to all that wonderful heat and have all the bacteria that are already in there have that work going and are breaking things down, it's going to take a little bit longer for those scraps to break down, and that's going to kind of just be an invite to unwanted pests, neighborhood cats or dogs or whatnot, to come try to get a snack. So having it in an actual compost pile is definitely a better way to do that, because you have that water, that oxygen, that heat generated, and you have those hosts of micro and macroorganisms doing that work.
All right, thank you. I think we just answered that little flurry of questions.
Yeah, Aleta, just one. Iris's question brought another one to mind. If you don't have a garden to put your compost in once it's good soil, then what do you do with it? Can you still have your compost bin or your compost pile, and then take that good dark soil that you end up with and spread that around in your yard, or
Yes.
give it away, or what do you do with it?
So compost makes a really good mulch. So if you don't want to use wood chip mulch, personally, I don't really care for the look of wood chip mulch. So if you have trees, if you have shrubs or any sort of landscaping at all, it would definitely benefit to put that around the base of those trees or the base of those shrubs. So that brings to mind another little tidbit that I wanted to mention. So if you are planning on starting a garden, you don't want to plant your seeds or put your transplants directly in 100% compost. So because compost has a lot of good nutrients, it doesn't always have the full range of macro and micronutrients that those plants need. If you plant them in full compost, especially if it hasn't aged long enough and it still might be warm and still might be have some food scraps breaking down, it can actually what's the word I'm looking for here? It can give too many of the wrong kind of nutrients to your plants. So that's why you want to use it as a soil amendment rather than just a straight planting medium, just to avoid burning your plants or giving them too much of the wrong nutrient, if that makes sense.
Aleta, we have a few more questions just firing in here. We have Janet wanted to know, any comments on using ripped up cardboard, egg cartons, and newspaper as your brown layer?
Yeah, all of those are perfectly fine to use. Cardboard and newspaper, they have a really high carbon component to them and take a very long time to break down. They actually work better as like a weed suppression layer. That's what I like to use them if I'm plotting out a little garden space. In the fall, before I'll let it overwinter, I just put cardboard or newspaper or straw down. So they will break down, and you'll have a better time of it if you chop them into very small pieces. But because they are so carbon heavy, and the newspaper, what is it about the newspaper? It's something to do with the how the gosh, what am I trying to say here? It's how the newspaper is made, and it has to do with the fibers of the newspaper. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So yes, you can use that. What was the other one? Cardboard, newspaper,
and egg cartons.
Egg cartons. Yeah, absolutely. I recycle, not the styrofoam ones. Styrofoam definitely belongs in the trash, unfortunately. But if you've got those paper ones, yep. I actually use those to start seeds. You can plant the seeds right in there, and then poke a little drainage hole or two in the bottom, and when the seed sprouts, you can put that right in your garden.
That's a great idea. Father Iggy had a follow-up question to your worms. If he was to go get the red wrigglers, where would he find red wrigglers?
Gosh, other than going out and digging up some soil in the woods, which is how I come across a lot of them, the only thing that I can think of would be like a bait shop. I mean, I grew up in a fishing town, so they were kind of all over the place. But
yeah, I know you can actually, I can actually interject a little bit because we do a little fishing in my family. But if you go over to Walmart will sell all sorts of worms. They'll sell the Canadian night crawlers, and they'll sell the red wrigglers as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only thing that I would be able to think of that. But I always have a little garden wherever I go outside, and I'll just dig up in my yard until I find some, making sure not to cut them in half, of course, but just using a couple of those, and you'll get your vermicomposting started very well, very easily.
All right, I have one more question here on the list. Janine Clarkson wanted to know, could you blend the scraps in a food processor and then pour the liquid into the garden?
So that is a really good question. You can make something called compost tea, and it's kind of what it is. I've never used a blender, so I can't answer that from experience or any firsthand knowledge. But yes, you can. You just kind of let all of your food scraps and all of your compost components kind of brew together into a liquid in a tea. And then, yes, you can use that as a soil amendment. Absolutely.
Would they pour that directly into the garden, or would it go into the compost, wait for it to decompose, and then put that in the garden?
You could water the garden with it directly like that. I have a special watering can. So once it kind of, I would drain out any of the slurry that was there, but then that remaining liquid, just put it in a watering can, and you can put it around the base of your plants though. You don't want to water your plants directly with it, again, because there's a lot of nitrogen in there. You don't want to burn the leaves and burn your plants. So always water and use your compost at the base of any plants that you have.
Russ Testa had a tip for everybody. If you're looking for red wigglers, he says they're available online from groups like Arbico.
Okay.
So he put that down in the chat for everybody to see.
I've never heard of that place. Must be maybe a gardening supply store.
Yeah, I guess we could do a Google search and probably find it.
Google knows all.
That's right.
All right. Any other questions? I love it. These questions are great.
Richard and Lindeen, that's my parents from Buffalo, New York.
All right.
They have a question. They said, can you use dissolved yeast to speed up decomposition?
I have never heard of that, so I cannot answer that in the affirmative or the negative, but that is a really interesting concept. So I'm assuming you might be thinking of like baking yeast or brewer's yeast, if I'm understanding that correctly. That is a different type of yeast than you might find in the wild, but so I'm not sure about that.
All right. I think that's our last question for the moment.
All right. Well, that was everything that I had. My last slide was, well, sorry if you can't read that. That was supposed to be in black font, but it's purple. That has our website, my email, our office phone number there. So I am always happy to talk to people, answer any other questions, work with you if you want. In addition to our litter pickups and our outreach and education, we also like to help out with beautification projects as we're able. I know, Scott, you and I have one on the back burner for whenever we're able to get this done, to put in gardens and outdoor classrooms and such. So if anybody needs to get a hold of me, this is how you do it.
All right, that's excellent. Yeah, Aleta, we will we'll take your contact information then, and as we will be sending out more information for the people who signed up for the webinars this week. So we will include that, make sure that as long as you're comfortable with that, we will give them all of your contact information via email, so they will have it. Obviously, if folks, if you've written it down already, that's fine too. You will also have access to the replay. Looks like we had another question pop in. I think we've got a couple more minutes here.
Yeah.
From Paula Hillary. Is there a ratio of brown to green? Is it equal parts, or how do you figure that out?
So it's kind of a learn by doing type of a thing to figure out if you need more of your brown versus more of your green. The ratio is generally best of 25 or 30 parts of brown or carbon to 1 part nitrogen. That number has to do with specific materials that you're adding in. Like ash is actually 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen, but that's in its own chemical makeup, if that makes sense. Cardboard is about 300 to 1. That's why it takes so long for it to break down. But there is generally a right or wrong. I will add, so for every layer, I always add a little bit more of the brown to the green. So maybe 1/3 to 2/3 of nitrogen or the green and 2/3 carbon. So I always have it a little heavy on the brown just to keep that from getting a little too stinky.
Okay, so that's kind of the safe route to go then, to make sure you're not stinking your neighbors out.
Yeah.
or attracting pests, as we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now,
I was going to interject too, Brandon, that Aleta is going to be back later this week. So if more people are interested in learning about Keep Prince William Beautiful, they can check that out. I believe that's Friday at 10 a.m.
Yep. She'll be back later on this week. Aleta, I just one question. I know we're at the top of the hour, so we're going to be wrapping things up in a moment here. I was told, and this goes back a few years, but I remember someone telling me, because I was talking about wanting to compost, and they were adamant that you can't put table scraps in the compost. And so if I'm understanding it right from your presentation, it's the fact that there might be animal products or oils in, quote, table scraps. But like if you clean the vegetables before you cook them, all of the scraps from that could go into the compost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think you're right on with your with what you are thinking they were telling you there. Yeah, a lot of your compost. Well, we don't have a lot of leftover cooked foods. Usually we're pretty good about eating it all up. So I guess for my own composting purposes, we generally do the uncooked, the raw, just kind of like the odds and ends and bits and pieces. But if there's no meat or dairy in there, there's no reason that you can't compost your cooked food.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, I think, yeah, it looks like people are saying thank you. Very informative. If anyone's interested, Russ Testa put the link to the Arbico Organics.
Oh, lovely.
In the chat, he said they do a great deal of beneficial insects and other natural methods of growing. They do large and small scale for farms and home gardens. So, yes. So, yeah, like I said, we are actually just past the top of the hour. Aleta, did you have any final comments? If not, I'll close this out.
No, I think I've covered pretty much everything, and what I didn't, I will cover on Friday.
Yes. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for Compost, Nature's Way of Recycling. This was the second webinar of our first ever St. Francis of Assisi Eco Summit. And for everyone watching, again, thank you so much for attending. I know it can be difficult to remember to join these things live. So glad that you were here to able to ask us questions and participate. Know that you should be receiving an email with a link to the replay of this webinar. Unfortunately, the automated replay can only be accessed by people who were actually registered for the webinar. However, within the next probably week or so, we'll be editing the webinar recordings and we'll upload those to YouTube. So once that happens, the Care for Creation Committee will be sending you information on where to find it. And at that point, you can share that link with anyone, family and friends, and anyone who wants to, whether they were registered for the webinar or not, will be able to watch that. So we would encourage you to pass this information along once we've got it posted where everyone can view it. One final housekeeping tip. Please note that by registering for this webinar, you were automatically added to our St. Francis of Assisi Care for Creation email list. Trust me, we won't bombard you with email, and we'll try to make everything that we send valuable and actionable. But if you really don't want to receive email from us, there is an unsubscribe link in the footer of every email we send to that list. So just click that link. Boom, you're unsubscribed. You don't need to send me emails asking me to remove you from the list. Just click the unsubscribe link and the emails will stop, I promise. But thanks again for attending. Don't miss tomorrow night's webinar. It is Stop Doom and Gloom with Blooms, how to grow your own pollinator garden. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says that pollinators are the engines that run healthy habitats. And whether you have a few feet on a balcony or a large yard in the country or anything in between, you can help. So join us tomorrow night. You'll learn how to plan, build, and grow your own garden that will ensure the future is filled with butterflies and unicorns and rainbows and I'm sorry, butterflies and pollinators and all of those good things. With that, we will bring this webinar to a close. I have been Brandon Jubar, your host this evening. I'd like to do one more shout out to Aleta Daniels for speaking to us tonight. Thank you again, Aleta.
Thank you very much.
All right. You can actually see Aleta, as Scott mentioned, again, this Friday morning at 10 a.m. Not Friday. We're switching to figured you'd want to be doing family stuff at 7 p.m. on Friday night. So Friday, the webinar will be at 10 a.m. Tomorrow's webinar is at 7 and Thursdays is at 7 as well. But Aleta will join us again Friday morning at 10 a.m. She will come back to talk to us about keeping the local area clean, green, and beautiful. But this is goodbye until tomorrow night. God bless. Thank you for caring for our common home. Good night, everybody. Good night, Scott. Good night, Aleta.